An overview of keto and fasting for men and for women. It's slightly different for men, it's slightly different for women, it's slightly different for athletes, and we need to look at the big picture. So what I'm showing you today is actually a presentation that I put on in Austin, Texas. And we have some high quality footage. It's the presentation that I did at KetoCon here in 2019. And I wanted to be able to share it with you. So I asked the producers if I could share the content with you so that you could see it as if you were there. So what you're about to see is literally a full presentation that was presented live. It's going to share all the details of the ketogenic diet, fasting, but also break down how it's different for men and women and some of the things that you can do as far as a takeaway is concerned. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. And after you watch this video, I do wanna make sure that you check out Thrive Market. So I've teamed up with Thrive Market to be able to bring you a keto box. So literally, it's an online grocery store. I've been able to compile groceries that I would normally get when I'm doing either keto or fasting and put them into a box that my viewers can check out at Thrive Market. So after you watch this presentation, check them out down in the description. You're not gonna regret it, there's some awesome stuff. So without further ado, it's gonna head on over to Brian on stage introducing me, and then stick through the video, because I come on stage and then wow your minds with a bunch of keto and fasting science. Let's rock and roll.
Who here is familiar with like really good looking guys on YouTube, right? Come on, come on. Well, this is our next guest, Mr. Thomas DeLauer. What'd I tell you, huh?
What's going on?
Thanks, buddy.
Hey, who here's not eating? Come on. Okay, there we go. Wow, this is awesome. Honestly, this is the first event that I've spoken at that actually has like a packed house like this, so this is super awesome. Usually I'm looking at a little teeny camera lens, and I always say like I'm probably one of the most introverted people that you would meet, and you would never really know that about me, but I can look at a camera and I can talk to millions of people, but when I have a big audience in front of me, it's, not gonna lie, it's pretty cool. So, and I was joking too, I think my brand is finally big enough that I can be a guy that actually can just wear a ball cap on stage. Like I've always wanted to be that guy where I don't have to wear jeans. I'm not quite to the point where I can wear flip-flops and just get away with it, but you know, we're off to a decent start. So. Anyway, thank you all for being here. This is really cool. Austin is super special to both my wife and I. If you've watched my channel for long enough, you've probably seen that we lived here for a little while. And back when I was working in the healthcare industry and knew that, that all started here in Austin. So some mad props to Austin. And I'm going to upset some people when I say hook 'em, but hook 'em. So let's go ahead and rock and roll with this. I outlined this big old long presentation because I figured I can consolidate things as much as I need to. But as I've roamed around and I've talked to more and more people, I realized that a lot of you guys really want just good interaction, and you all have questions and fun things like that. So I'm going to try to make this fun and interactive, and I'm going to try to streamline my presentation to make it closer to like 30 minutes so I can open up some Q&A. And then the cool thing is after this presentation, I'm on a panel directly after this, so it's going to be a good opportunity to ask more questions and have some fun. And then after that, I'll be doing more Q&A and stuff at the Redmond Real Salt booth. So what I want to talk about today is something pretty general. It's the ketogenic diet for men versus women, with an emphasis on some of the stuff with the thyroid, because that's a big piece right now, and there's been a lot of sort of science, pseudoscience coming out saying that keto is bad for the thyroid and that it's going to slow your metabolism down, and I want to just take some opportunities to debunk that. And again, those of you that watch me know that I take a pretty well-rounded approach to keto. I'm not strict keto. I go through periods where I utilize keto when I need to, and then I phase out where I indoctrinate small amounts of carbs at specific periods of time with utilizing longer periods of fasting, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that it's a tool in your toolbox, and it can make you a very, very metabolically efficient individual. So what we're going to cover, a ketosis overview, then we're going to go through kind of the history of ketosis, what ketosis is not, health benefits of a keto diet, then we're going to get into keto for men and keto for women specifically, and then I do want to touch a little bit on training in a ketogenic state, just because it is something that I know my fan base and my viewer base in particular really likes to watch my keto content, because I come at it from a little bit more of a sports performance side, so I know there's a lot of those of you here. And then I'm going to end with what I call my 10 keto commandments. You guys are going to get a sneak peek at a video that's going to go out in the next week or two. So the first thing, for those of you that are not super familiar with how the ketogenic diet works, I wouldn't be doing a disservice if I didn't explain this a little bit. So when you restrict your daily carb intake, obviously generally less than 50 grams of carbs per day, that metabolic switch occurs, and you end up having those free fatty acids get converting into ketones in the liver, which therefore get utilized by the mitochondria inside all kinds of different cells within the body. So the three types of ketones that you hear me talking about all the time, and you hear everyone talking about all the time, are going to be acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. The only one that we're really concerned with in this case is really going to be BHB, beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, acetone. Although there are means to measure them, they're not what you want to measure. Acetoacetate is sort of an early ketone body before beta-hydroxybutyrate supersedes that. And then acetone is sort of again, kind of a byproduct. It's almost the self-destruction of acetoacetate that just manifests through our breath and through our urine a little bit. There we go. So a quick history of ketosis, and I'm just going to paraphrase this. So the history of ketosis, when someone bags on the keto diet, when they come to you and they say, oh my gosh, you're eating all this bacon and eggs, and you're eating all these high-fat foods, and you're killing yourself, well, one thing that you can tell them is that it was actually born from fasting. It was born from something completely different. And it came to be simply because when they looked at the epileptic populations in the early 1900s, they saw that, okay, all these epileptic patients were having immense success with controlling their seizures when they would go through these extended periods of fasting. Like when they would go for 2, 3, 4 days without eating, they wouldn't have any seizures, and it was awesome. But it wasn't until the 1920s when they started saying, okay, well, we're seeing more and more instances of epilepsy, but we're having a hard time being able to get a lot of people to fast. It's not easy to get someone to fast for 3 or 4 days. By show of hands, did anyone do the 72-hour fast with me that I did earlier this week? Nice. That's a lot of money saved on groceries right there. That's cool. So, and you know that was a big step. So imagine having to do that all the time. So it was really hard to get the patient population to do that. So they started figuring out, okay, we need to find what it is about fasting that makes these people ultimately not have seizures. And through a lot of due diligence and a lot of different scientific research, they ultimately found that it was something known as beta-hydroxybutyrate. They had this unique thing in their bloodstream. So then they said, okay, well, how can we also get beta-hydroxybutyrate in the body without making them fast? And that's when it took them a couple years, but they figured out by simply depriving the body of carbohydrates, of glucose, voila, they produce these same ketones. So ketosis was born from fasting, and that's how they kind of get married together and why they get grouped in together a lot. But fasting is a way to get a lot of the benefits of the ketogenic diet without necessarily having to eat a ketogenic diet, which we can talk about a little bit later too. What ketosis is not low carb, and I put a clear line of delineation there, and that's because low carb, although is very effective, low carb is not necessarily sustainable because low carb leaves you in that gray area. Ketosis is when you cross into that magical phase where your liver is producing ketone bodies. Low carb is where you're just keeping the carbs low, but you're not pushing yourself that little bit extra that you need to cross into that euphoric state that we know of as ketosis. And then I also have to address the fact that keto is not ketoacidosis. And I'm talking to a group of my friends here, right? But normally, if I'm giving a presentation, it's at a different health conference that might not be as open to the ketogenic diet. So I have to stand here and justify. But ketoacidosis is something different. Ketoacidosis is something that a type 1 diabetic or the like would face when they don't produce insulin. We still need insulin to some degree to allow a ketone into the cell. So if someone that is diabetic or type 1 diabetic has too much in the way of ketones and they're not producing insulin, then they're going to go into ketoacidosis. But someone that is not type 1 diabetic, it is very, I shouldn't say never, but it is very, very, very difficult to get yourself into those dangerous levels of ketones, like 18 plus millimoles. Like that's just not happening if you have normal functioning insulin and normal functioning beta cells. I'm going to kind of blaze through this part. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on health benefits of a keto diet because I think we all know that keto is awesome there. But the one thing I do want to touch on, and I talk about a lot in my videos that's going to come full circle as I go through this presentation, is that one of the biggest reasons that keto works so well for weight loss isn't because you're just magically taking fat and burning it. I mean, sure, that's great, but it really is the fact that you can lose weight while having your muscles spared. That is really the biggest thing. Our biggest driver of our metabolism outside of, honestly, genetics is our resting metabolic rate and is our muscle mass. And I don't care if you are a 95-pound, 4'11" person or 350 pounds, it's all relative how much muscle you have on your frame. You don't need to be super yoked out, but if you have a bunch of muscle, you're going to have a higher resting metabolic rate. And as soon as we start to lose weight, one of the first things our body likes to do is sacrifice some muscle tissue, which drops our resting metabolic rate. So keto is awesome because of that, and that's that study that was published in Nutrition and Metabolism that found that it had a big effect on resting metabolic rate. So this particular study took a look at 20 obese patients, followed a low-calorie keto diet in order to induce weight loss. Low calorie meaning like 600 to 800 calorie deficit. So the subjects lost around 45 pounds each over the course of 4 months. Okay, that's a pretty aggressive weight loss to lose 45 pounds in 4 months. And what they found is despite them losing a bunch of weight like that in a rapid period of time, there was no significant difference in their basal metabolic rate. So what that means is, like, if you were to take people that were losing weight not on a ketogenic diet and lost 45 pounds, their metabolism would be a whole different beast. That's like when you start to lose weight, you're losing weight and your metabolism is slowing down with it because you have less mass that your body needs to incinerate calories for. So that is honestly the coolest thing about keto, in my opinion, is the fact that you can lose weight, you lose 100 pounds or at least 45 as justified and not change your metabolism. So you can be 100, for lack of a better way of saying it, I guess, 155 pounds and have the metabolism of a 200-pound person if that's what you weighed before. That is freaking cool. Honestly, this study kind of continues on, and then I'm consolidating as much as I can. There's another study I talk about lean tissue and metabolism in general. It just kind of further discusses how when we are more heavily muscled, when we do have more muscle, our metabolism is significantly higher. Then, of course, we have keto and our hunger hormones. This is probably the second biggest benefit to the keto diet and why so many people, by default, love it, why it just feels so good and they may not even recognize it. Although some people on the internet tend to disagree with me when we talk about calories, but a calorie is still a calorie, and thermodynamics still do apply. So what I mean by that is, like, yes, if you consume less calories than you burn, or if you consume more calories than you burn, you gain weight, and vice versa. But we can't always balance that exactly. And again, something I always reference, and I'm going to jump to a different, digress for a second. If you look at your calories on a daily basis, you're going to set yourself up for failure because you're going to end up constantly looking at a number every single day. Look at your calories over the course of a week, and your life will be a lot easier because then you're not defying physics. You're not defying the law of thermodynamics. You're not defying that. Calories are still calories, but your body's going to go through fluctuations. Right now, I might be burning more calories than I was an hour ago, minute for minute. So it would be silly for me to think about the fact that I'm in a caloric deficit or a surplus right now because I just don't know. If I eat an M&M right this second, does that mean that right this second I am in a caloric surplus? Like for the nanosecond that I eat that M&M? I guess so. So you see kind of my theory there. So when you look at it over the course of a week, it just makes so much more sense. And that's why fasting works so well, because you can block it out. You can have little breaks where caloric surges and then rest period. But my point with saying all this is a lot of times on a keto diet, we don't realize that we are consuming a lot less. And it simply has to do with the fact that we're producing a lot less ghrelin. We're producing a lot less of these hunger hormones. But the other one is good old CCK, cholecystokinin. So this is what is produced in our intestinal tract or released in our intestinal tract when we consume copious amounts of fats. And that's why I always say when you're starting a keto diet, keep your fats higher than you might otherwise, simply because of the satiating effect. You can certainly have more protein on keto, and we'll talk about that because, again, if you watch my videos, I've said this multiple times, but I've had to eat my own words from a few years ago when we used to think that too much protein would kick you out of keto. It can to a degree, but not nearly as much as we thought. But when you're first starting keto, I always recommend keeping your fats higher versus trying to go for the protein, simply because you're going to get much more of a satiating effect, and that makes life a lot easier. So cognitive function. I started keto and I lost a lot of weight with keto, and that was great. But quite frankly, the reason I stay keto is for the cognitive function. There's multiple ways to skin a cat, multiple ways to lose weight, multiple ways to keep weight off. But very, very few give you the benefit of actually having some awesome cognitive function too. The reason that I can crank out the videos that I crank out and articulate fairly complex subject matter is largely in part to the fact that I have a pretty consistent flow of ketones flowing through my bloodstream. So, and it does this through some different ways. It's not like you just have fat coming into your brain and it's that simple. It actually increases the amount of mitochondria that are in your brain. So we're actually creating more energy powerhouses within our cell. But then, to make matters better, it's also increasing the efficiency of that. So if the mitochondria is the energy factory, if it's a factory, for lack of a better term, we're creating more factories, but we're also making the factories more efficient. So, I mean, it's a win-win on both sides. But the other thing, and the thing that I like, because I've suffered from anxiety for a long time, is it tips that scale from glutamate over to GABA, and that's a big one. By show of hands here, like, who went keto and noticed a big drop in just their anxiety levels, their just ability to be, yeah, that's awesome. Because, I mean, those of you that have battled with anxiety and know what it's like to have panic attacks and know what it's like to deal with that, you know what I'm talking about. It sucks. And to be able to actually conquer that stuff is really cool just by a few shifts of your diet. And it has to do with tipping that scale over to gamma-aminobutyric acid versus being running on glutamate. And I'll share you all the details on that, but essentially, we don't want a lot of glutamate. It's excitatory, it gets us excited, it gets us amped up, and it's the wrong kind of amp. It's the anxious amp, not the good energy. And it's important that I note, too, that you will still be using carbs for fuel even when you're in ketosis. So remember this. Your brain prefers to run on carbs, despite what people will say. Your brain still runs on carbs, but it doesn't have to run on carbs that come from your diet. Your body will manufacture carbs. Carbs are just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's all they are. And your body has the ability to make them. So we don't need to consume them. So those that hate on us because we talk about not having to eat carbs, and they say, you're eliminating an entire macronutrient. No, we're not. Like, our body has the ability to create it. We don't need to consume it. I'm not saying it's bad if you do, but you don't need to. Our body creates them, and it does this through multiple different pathways because our brain still runs on glucose. About 65 to 70% of the brain, as far as we know now, still uses glucose, but another 30% can operate on ketones. So what ends up happening is when a portion of the brain can utilize those ketones, it makes it so that you are highly effective with the glucose that is being used otherwise. And here's another cool nerdy fact, is that when you're fasting or when you're in ketosis and you develop something that sounds bad but is really good, known as peripheral insulin resistance, which is where your body's cells throughout the extremities, throughout your entire body, become somewhat insulin resistant. And at first, you're like, wait a minute, keto's making me diabetic? No, not at all. It's peripheral, which means that your cells are getting so used to using fats, they're kind of like, oh, there goes glucose. I don't really need it. So where does that glucose go? Well, it doesn't just go out through your urine. It actually gets shuttled to the brain. And some studies have shown that we actually, on a keto diet, get more glucose going to the brain, which is a good thing because it's going where it's supposed to go, in my opinion. So sometimes the cognitive function that you get, that improvement, is actually coming from the reallocation of carbohydrates going to your brain, which is a cool thing. So I always like to say that because I'm not an anti-carb guy, because without carbs, like not being existent, we wouldn't live, right? All right, now I want to get into men versus women a little bit. I'm going to start on the male side, and then I'm going to go into the female side, because the female side actually has a little bit more complexity to it, simply because women are a little bit more sensitive to things that affect the thyroid. So this has got some cool studies. So men are usually a little bit more prone to type 2 diabetes, at least we seem to see this. So type 2 diabetes is a condition where excessive glucose in the blood, which is a person's cell, becomes resistant to insulin. Most of you know that. This study, Diabetologica, reviewed the records of 95,000 men and women with type 2 diabetes and found men are more prone to type 2, and they're also more susceptible to lower BMI. So that means that men can develop diabetes a lot easier than women at a lower weight. So women have to usually gain a little bit more weight to be susceptible. Not always the case, but so believe that men are less sensitive to insulin, possibly because men tend to distribute fat more readily around the liver than women do. So men tend to see a lot more cases of fatty liver and things like that, which can definitely contribute to this. So a study from Nutrition and Metabolism conducted a 24-week study in which research compared the effects of a keto diet versus a low glycemic diet on glycemic control in 49 people with type 2. So both interventions led to improvements in hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and weight loss. However, the low-carb keto group had greater improvements in hemoglobin A1C, basically greater improvements in body weight, the right kind of cholesterols, the HDLs, but also the right kind of LDLs, which were mentioned in this particular abstract. Diabetes medications were reduced or eliminated in 95.2% of the low-carb keto diet versus 62% of the low glycemic diet. So I just think this is really cool because it's specifically looking at the situation for, I mean, this was men and women, but I wanted to put it in the men's side simply because it's skewed slightly more towards men since more men have diabetes. Hemoglobin A1C provides the estimate of the glycemic control. The higher your A1C level, the poorer your blood sugar control and the higher your risk of diabetes. If those of you that have battled diabetes or are familiar know what I'm talking about there. Okay, now the testosterone side. So this is where things get interesting for men. And there's some studies out there, or some people out there, it's not even studies, it's kind of anecdotal stuff. It says that if you go on a keto diet, that you are going to ultimately lower your testosterone levels. And that's because there's some earlier research that showed that you need some carbs for Leydig cell function, which are the cells in your testes that actually will produce testosterone that is in its usable bioavailable form. This study was pretty cool. So Journal of Strength and Conditioning took 25 resistance-trained men and divided them into two groups. So we've got the very low-carb keto group, and we've got a traditional Western diet. In this case, has 55% carbs, 25% protein, 25% fat, 20% proteins for 11 weeks. Okay, so total cholesterol increased slightly in the very low-carb ketogenic group. Now, most of the cholesterol that was raised was HDL. There was a rise in LDL as well, but I can talk about that a little bit more for anyone that's concerned. I'll just touch on it for a second. The whole LDL, HDL thing is definitely not something we need to really be concerned with anymore. There's various forms of LDL. I'm not an expert in that world because I can go down that rabbit hole like really deep if I wanted to, but VLDL, various particle sizes, and we're starting to uncover that. LDL delivers cholesterol. HDL brings it back to the liver for processing. Of course, we need to still deliver cholesterol. We need to deliver cholesterol for so many different cell functions. So why is LDL bad? Well, LDL is only considered bad if you have high levels of inflammation already. Inflammation is going to make it so that the cells and the LDL receptors become somewhat inflamed, which triggers a bunch of macrophages, a bunch of white blood cells to pool up around an LDL receptor and cause literally inflammation and swelling at the arterial level. And then, and only then, does plaque really develop. It's developing because of the inflammation. And I'm just curious, what do you guys think the biggest driver of inflammation is in our diet? All right, sugar. So there you go. It's not so much about the fats, it's about the fats just happen to kind of get wrongfully accused. It really is the sugar that's triggering this. And the ketogenic diet by default is so anti-inflammatory because beta-hydroxybutyrate is one of the biggest things that can blunt nuclear factor kappa B, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-6, all these big cytokines that drive inflammation, and it blunts it. So therefore, our cholesterol levels don't matter. I shouldn't be very careful saying this, but they don't matter as much when you're on a keto diet because you're blunting inflammation that would normally cause that to ever be a problem. So now that we can not worry about that portion, let's back to testosterone. You need cholesterol for testosterone. So testosterone increased significantly in the keto group. 118 nanograms per deciliter as compared to the Western actually went down, lost 36 nanograms per deciliter, while insulin increased significantly in the Western group compared to the very low-carb keto group. And there is a correlation between insulin and testosterone. So that's 11 weeks, and that is a huge increase. For those of you guys out there that get your testosterone levels checked, you know, they'll tell you like, okay, if you're below 300 or 400 or whatever is going to be the low marker, then you need to bump it up to get into normal range. I mean, the average male right now over 35 sits around 400. So we're talking about like a huge increase, 118 out of that. So that's a big bump. And then we talk about hypertension. So obesity, work stress, all these things, of course, can lead to hypertension. We used to think that salt was the culprit. That's kind of hilarious now because, again, the studies are starting to show that it's sugar, it's inflammation. Salt actually kind of has the opposite effect. The bigger causes of hypertension are going to be hyperinsulinemia. So when you have high levels of insulin, because it ends up triggering all kinds of blood pressure responses from the liver, from the kidneys, that ends up making it a problem. It's not peripheral. You know, if we're thinking that blood pressure is an issue because of sodium, we're treating an issue that is peripheral, like actually in the veins, in our arteries, right? We're not treating it from what is triggering the actual blood flow in the first place, which is going to be different kind of catecholamine responses, different hormone responses, responses from the kidneys, you name it. And then, of course, insulin resistance also plays a big role. So this study looked at keto and blood pressure. So a study published in the journal Archives of Internal Medicine found that keto diet has a positive effect on lowering blood pressure. 146 overweight or obese subjects were randomized to either a keto diet or Ilostat therapy, which was a weight loss medication. 120 milligrams, that part's not too important. Of the study, 57 of the keto group and 65 of the low-fat group completed measurements at 48 weeks. At the end of the 48 weeks, researchers found the keto group had lowered their blood pressure significantly more. So the keto group's systolic blood pressure was reduced by 5.9 millimeters of mercury, while the low-fat group was reduced by 1.5. Now, not a huge difference, but my point in saying that is this is a high-fat diet, a high-sodium diet generally, and actually saw a better decrease than just going on a healthy diet. Now, this was getting kind of fun too. Cortisol. This is a whole new world that I'm just starting to scratch the surface on, so you can expect some more content on this coming up. Because cortisol, it's good and bad. We have to take the good with the bad with it. So men are less likely to seek out social support when stressed, and mean cortisol responses have been shown to be 1.5 to 2-fold higher in men compared with women. So men tend to have more cortisol. Surprise, surprise, right? Like, I think women tend to manage stress. They can handle kids. Having one kid of my own, I don't know how my wife does it. So men, we tend to freak out a little bit more with it. So when it comes to cortisol, keto diet has been unfairly viewed as a stressor because it puts the body into that starvation mode, which we have to address because it's a little bit deeper than that. So when you initially begin keto, it will be stressful because your body's dealing with the carb withdrawal. But it's a healthy physiological response because once your body fat adapts, things obviously get better. And once you become keto adapted, cortisol returns back to baseline. So it'll be the people that'll tell you that, oh, well, you're going to be starving your body, you're depriving yourself of carbs, so you're going to have all this belly fat that's going to accumulate because you're stressed out and your cortisol levels are going. Well, first of all, cortisol can be your friend, which I'm going to save for another day. But it also goes back to normal once you're fat adapted. So an 8-week keto diet study conducted by Jeff Volek found no differences between subjects' cortisol levels pre and post intervention. Stress triggers the release of what's called corticotropin in the hypothalamus, so basically a chain reaction of things that are going to happen. It causes the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropin hormone, which again, not super important now, all just a chain reaction that basically creates the production of glucocorticoids out of the adrenals. If you've heard of adrenal fatigue, that's basically what I'm talking about. It triggers the production of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which if you watch my videos on fasting, once again, we want this. Okay, we don't always want cortisol, but we do want the right amounts of glucocorticoids because that is what's going to actually give us the fight or flight response that allows us to burn fat. The cool thing, and the thing that we don't always know and really comprehend, is that we aren't really burning fat unless we are in that stress mode. And I know I overuse the air quotes, but I guess this is how I roll. But we have to be stressed out for lipolysis to really be effective. And when we're fasting, the reason we're burning fat is because we're stressed out, because we're not eating, right, to a mild degree. We're controlling that stress. So cortisol is not necessarily a bad thing, so I wanted to debunk that. Then cortisol and sodium. So this is a big one, because I'm big into the whole salt world. A lack of sodium on a keto diet can cause the brain to send signals to the adrenal gland to increase the release of hormones that are responsible for water balance in which cortisol is released. So when you're on a keto diet, it's very important that you have the sodium for this reason too. I talk about it with NST receptors and various things, but when you drop a bunch of water because you start keto, it throws your cortisol levels out of whack. And because your sodium levels are messed up. So you got to bring the sodium back in and it will balance your cortisol so you don't have that initial reaction we talked about earlier where because you're starting keto, your cortisol levels go up. You can mitigate that by adding some more salt in. Again, gets rid of the keto flu and all that stuff. I'm going to touch on this one really quick. Basically, they found the keto diet is going to help out with kidney stones. Again, more men have issues with kidney stones than women. So I'm going to spare you the details on that because I want to make sure we're being respectful of time. All right, now let's talk about keto for women. So this is a big one. So keto for women, is it different than for men? Ultimately, I think how we adjust our macros and everything like that really doesn't need to shift a whole lot. There's just different things that you need to be aware of. This first study was looking at, actually make sure this wasn't I do skip ahead to the PCOS one. Basically, this first study just talks about the weight loss side of things, which we all know. I want to skip ahead to the PCOS side of things. The reason that I bring up PCOS is because it has a direct correlation with pregnancy. It has a direct correlation with issues that women face even if they don't realize it. PCOS is just a big, glaring problem that we notice. And there was a study that took a look at the keto diet with PCOS, and I found that really the big issue is the hyperinsulinemia. So when you have a lot of insulin because you're consuming a bunch of carbs, your insulin levels are high, a lot of times that is what contributes to PCOS in the first place because it increases the androgen secretion from the ovary. So it basically makes it so the woman has almost too much male hormones coming out that's throwing things totally awry. So women with PCOS tend to have higher levels of insulin, and elevated levels of insulin cause the ovaries to produce more androgens. Androgens are what give us male characteristics as men. So insulin also decreases the production of sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. So in this case, it's a glycoprotein that prevents testosterone from freely entering cells. Men, we want less SHBG. Women, you want a little bit more. Okay, men, we don't want our testosterone bound up by sex hormone binding globulin. We want our testosterone to be free and running around and allowing us to be men and allowing us to build muscle. Women don't want to have free testosterone. They need a small amount because it's all a counterbalance, but what happens with PCOS is they end up having these lower levels of SHBG that make it so that they have too much free testosterone, ultimately too much in the way of androgens. So that's what causes the fatigue, that's what causes the mood swings that are associated with PCOS, and these problems that women deal with, not only with PCOS, but just with any typical menstruation or anything like that. It's going to be, those are the things that actually trigger even the hot flashes, and if you feel like you're happy, then you're sad. It's a real thing, and it has to do with, again, those hormones and those androgens. So the hormonal imbalance involves too much luteinizing hormone, spare you the details there. But basically, what that ultimately comes down to is the ketogenic diet has made it so those symptoms are significantly less, and the study, the details there? So I might be missing the slide there that actually said that. But ultimately, it was a pretty small study. It was like 11 people, and they took 11 people with PCOS. They found 10 of them ended up having huge improvements, and 5 of the 11 women that were in that study ended up actually getting pregnant during the study. And people with PCOS have a hard time getting pregnant, a very hard time getting pregnant. So the fact that even in the course of a short study, like almost half of the women ended up just getting pregnant because they were probably actively trying. So that's the big thing, and I'll come back to that. So keto and pregnancy is huge. But then we talk about menopause too. A woman's ovaries are the source of estrogen and progesterone, and this is the kind of the key thing when we're talking about going through menopause and big hormonal shifts. So that's going to control the reproductive system. So 2 other hormones involved are the luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, and that's going to regulate those progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. So when we have follicle-stimulating hormone producing the estrogen and causing the release of the eggs, that's how everything kind of starts. So when that process finally stops, you can imagine there's a hormonal cascade that throws everything off. The main problem, of course, being insulin resistant, which sets off the other hormonal cascade. So this study, chronic inflammation can increase during menopause, so it's critical to take steps to reduce it. This is where keto comes in, again, with the anti-inflammatory effects. So BHB blocks what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is an immune system receptor that's directly linked with inflammation. And when you look at menstruation, you look at going through menopause in general, we have big surges, or I shouldn't say we do, but women have big surges of inflammation anyway, and it's directly linked with those. So the NLRP3 inflammasome reacts quickly to these threats and helps it out. Keto, again, anti-inflammatory. So we haven't figured out exactly how the keto diet can affect the brain when it comes down to menopause, but we can figure out what's happening indirectly and treat the issue. Most of the weight gain and most of the fatigue that comes with menopause is inflammation related. Okay? Inflammation is simply your body's immune system being on hyperdrive when you don't know it. Imagine having the flu, but not knowing you have the flu because you just have it at a really low grade. That is essentially what's happening when you have inflammation. And someone had, a doctor that I know gave a really good example. If you have a cold, if you erase the fact that you have a stuffy nose and a sore throat, you don't feel clear in the mind, right? You don't feel good. Like your brain doesn't feel clear. That's a perfect example of inflammation in the brain. If you erase the other symptoms, that's what inflammation feels like. You're sick, so you have that. So you never feel clear and good. So that's what's happening to a small degree when you go through menopause, is you have this happening. So we're treating that part. Now, when we look at the brain, we have estrogen receptors in the body, and women have them in the brain. Men have them too, but women obviously have a lot more. So it ends up leaving the brain cells a lot more vulnerable as a woman goes through menopause. So utilizing ketones rather than glucose for fuel provides that steady, clean energy that ends up helping out a whole lot. And then, of course, we talk about pregnancy for a little bit, which I kind of touched on already, but I'll touch on this briefly. So a lot of times when women are pregnant, I get this question a lot. Should they go keto? Should they stay keto? Should they rotate carbs in and out? There's not a whole lot of conclusive research on it yet, but my personal opinion on it is that a little bit of glucose is important for proper fetus development. I really do think so, because we're building something, not just maintaining it. But once you get into the second and third trimester, like a lot of times the female is going to be naturally in a ketogenic state anyway, just because the fetus is robbing her body of so much. I shouldn't say robbing, but maybe not. They'd rob when they go to college, but not when, no, they rob it. So that's kind of what we're getting at here, is the woman is already getting into keto. And case in point, like I said earlier, your body's already producing glucose, and gluconeogenesis, creating glucose from proteins, it's all demand driven. If the body needs it or the fetus needs it, it's going to create it. So as long as calories are sufficient, that fetus is going to get what it needs. Now in the early stages, it might be wise to keep your glucose up a little bit, but second and third trimester, like I know a lot of pregnant women and women that have had babies that end up going keto like second and third trimester and have like insanely healthy babies, and I'd say my baby's one of them. Okay, now I want to talk about the thyroid for a little bit, and I know I don't even have a whole lot of time, but fortunately we've got the panel after this, so there's going to be definitely good opportunities for questions. So this study, Metabolism, Clinical and Experimental, so another study by Volek, so looked at the effects of a 6-week keto diet on total and regional body composition, the relationship with fasting hormone concentration. So 12 healthy, normal weight men switched from their habitual diet, and I know this study looked at men, but it's the same crosses over for women with thyroid, to a carbohydrate-restricted diet. Basically, one went keto, one didn't. 8 men served as controls, just consuming the normal diet. Fat mass was significantly decreased, lean body mass significantly increased. There was a significant decrease in serum insulin and an increase in total thyroxine, and the free T4 index and T3 was not directly measured, but there was no significant change. Again, I'm skimming it fast. What that meant is that T4 actually upregulated and T3 didn't change. So T4 upregulated, meaning that there was going to essentially be more T3. So this study took a look at keto and said, okay, there's no change to the thyroid. If anything, there's a positive effect on the thyroid. And again, it all comes down to the individual. There's a lot of different pieces here. But low T3 levels are actually associated with a longer lifespan. So we don't necessarily have to hate the fact that our T3 could get lower. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. Okay, lower levels of T3 means the body is not getting taxed as hard. If you're fasting, your thyroid levels are going to be low while you're fasting. Like, there's no denying that. But when you break your fast, your thyroid levels are going to upregulate. And they found in the age of 50 years, participants that had low to normal thyroid function live up to 3.5 years longer overall and 3.1 years longer without cardiovascular disease. So there are some benefits to having a little bit less thyroid function at that point in time. So it's all, again, about modulation. Periods of fasting, you're going to reduce T3. Okay? But as long as T4 isn't really changing and TSH isn't skyrocketing, your thyroid stimulating hormone, you're in a good spot. Because that is telling you that even if at this point in time your T3 is low, your T4 is going to bring it back up at some point in time. Now here's the interesting thing. This is what I really want to make a solid point with. You'll often hear that carbs increase T3, but in actuality, the thyroid increases T3 production to deal with the glucose. So this is like the big one here, because keto is not destroying your thyroid. What is happening is when you consume glucose, your thyroid has to upregulate T3 in order to only deal with the glucose. It has nothing to do with the rest of your metabolism or fat burning. Okay? It's like you have a certain amount of your thyroid hormone that is allocated specifically to deal with glucose. Okay? So utilizing that knowledge, think about this for a second. When you consume carbs, your thyroid has to ramp up T3, which means if you can go get your blood work tested, your doctor's going to say, hey, guess what? Your T3 is nice and high. Your thyroid's in good shape. Well, is it really? You don't know, because a vast majority of that thyroid hormone that was measured is literally just there to metabolize and help you even deal with the carbs in the first place. So you don't know what your real number is until you get the carbs out of the equation. So going keto, if you do see a decline, you're just seeing what your real number is. And you're leaving more of your thyroid capable to deal with metabolism versus actually having to just metabolize sugar. Does that all make sense? Because that's a really big point. Because you are actually, even if your number goes down, your thyroid is actually getting more effective. And that's what it's all about, doing the most with the least. That kind of goes on the same thing. This is kind of the other side of that study. Oh, that's why I was like, wait a minute. Okay, I do want to talk about this just for a second, and this is going to be the one that I really want to save for the panel. It's going to be talking about training in a ketogenic state. I talked about this a little bit in the VIP room when I did the VIP breakout, but basically, when you're on a ketogenic diet, you have a really unique ability to become what's called dual fueled, okay? You have the ability to utilize carbohydrates and fat at the same point in time. And you're basically putting yourself in a really cool state to be able to be more efficient, especially after you're fat adapted for maybe 8 weeks, 10 weeks, to be able to utilize ketones through your endurance work, but then utilize carbs when you're actually weight training. And I mean utilizing carbs as in the carbs that are stored in your body, not carbs you're consuming. So when people first start the keto diet, they're not there yet. So they feel this decline in performance and they throw in the towel. They say, I'm going keto, all of a sudden my endurance improved, but I'm not able to weight train anymore. I feel like I'm weak. Well, yeah, you will be weak for 6 or 8 weeks. You will be significantly weaker, but if you give yourself an opportunity to be fat adapted, the science is now showing that the mitochondria just develops the ability to actually utilize those fats. And one other thing I want to touch on with that is now there's science that shows that once you are fat adapted, the body can take those fats that you consume and break them down into free fatty acids and not even have to go through the liver to convert them into ketones to be used by skeletal muscle. What that means is normally you eat fats, goes to the liver turns those fats into ketones, those ketones get used by the cell, a little bit of a drawn out process. Now we're finding that once you are fat adapted, meaning if you stick with it, if you can stick with it for 3 months and be really strict, if you can stick with it even 2 or 3 months, what's gonna happen is your muscle cells are going to develop the ability to utilize free fatty acids directly and doesn't even have to go through the ketone process. So what that could mean is when you're measuring your ketones, you might find that your ketone levels even drop because your body is down-regulating the need for it. Your body's down-regulating. I don't need to produce as much ketones because now my muscle cells can use pure fat, fatty acids. But again, so that's pretty awesome stuff. Technically, I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of this stuff because I want to give you my 10 commandments really quick, and you guys are going to have to bum rush me off stage. So, all right, so the first one is thou shalt not hate carbs. Your body still needs them, and that's the thing I talked about, right? Like, doesn't mean you have to eat them, but don't hate on the carbs, okay? That's really important to be a mature keto person, all right? Otherwise, Lane Norton's going to attack you. 2, thou shalt not rely only on MCTs. I love MCT oil, but I see a lot of people like that just consume a ton of it. And this is a big thing because if you just only consume that and you don't get a broad spectrum of fats, then you leave yourself susceptible. Think of your fats like longer chain fats, shorter chain fats. They all provide different nutritional value. 3, thou shalt get adequate omega-3 and be careful of the omega-6s. Just a big thing. Like, you call it the keto wall. 3 months into keto, everyone's eating so much bacon and cheese and so much of this stuff that their omega-6 levels are slowly creeping up, and then you hit that keto wall, and 3 months in, the attrition rate is super high because your omega-6 profile is off and you start feeling like garbage. 4, thou shalt still consider fiber and sugar alcohol sometimes. Okay, before you start throwing tomatoes at me, the reason that I say this is play it safe. I always count fiber as half a carb. That's just what I do. It's just safer. And the reason is there's some evidence that shows that fiber doesn't affect blood glucose, but there's also some evidence that when it's broken down into disaccharides and broken down in our gut, that it can actually turn into a sugar. So why don't we just play it safe right now? Because the research and the jury is still out. So I count, if I see 1 gram of fiber, I count it as a half a carb. I don't completely get rid of it. 5, thou shalt not rely on ketone levels all the time. Use them as a data point, measure all the time and create a track record, and measure consistently under the same circumstances so you know where your data points are. 6, thou shalt get adequate minerals in. Get your salt in, get your magnesium in. And if you get your salt in, then your magnesium and your other minerals are going to be retained. So salt is the pinnacle of that, and it trickles down with the other minerals. 7, thou shalt not be afraid of protein. Okay, protein is not going to kick you out of keto like we used to think. Gluconeogenesis is demand-driven, not supply-driven, which means that it's only going to turn that protein into a sugar if it's needed, not just because there's supply. So eat that protein if you want to. 8, thou shalt be prepared. Bring protein shakes or nuts with you. That's a simple one. That's what I do. Macadamia nuts in my glove box all the time. Protein shakes in my glove box all the time. Because if I'm going to go into a dinner, I want to be able to consume that first so that I can be in control of what I eat. 9, thou shalt evade the keto police. If you come out of keto, It's not going to end your life. And I just say that so the last thing you need to do is be stressed out, okay? There are times and places where you can come out of keto. It's not the end of the world. 10, thou shalt stick with it for at least 8 weeks for fat adaptation. So if those of you that are just getting started, just make a promise to yourself that you're going to stick with it for at least 8 weeks. That's it. Sorry.